with sticks of twine-tied newspapers, clamber into the tailgate, cut the twine with my mother's sewing scissors, and ride around town, bouncing along on that bench while my father shouted out orders from the driver's seat. "Watch out for the dog," he'd holler between draws on his pipe. "Inside the screen door! Mailbox!" As the car crept along, never stopping, we'd each grab a paper and dash in the dark across icy driveways or dew-drunk grass, crashing seasonally into unexpected snowmen. "Back porch! Money under the mat!" He kept a list scrawled on the back of an envelope taped to the dashboard. The accounts. "They owe 3 weeks." He didn't need to remind us. We knew each Doberman and every debt. We'd deliver our papers, the Worcester Sunday telegrams, and then run back to the car and scramble onto the tailgate, dropping the coins we'd collected into empty Briggs tobacco tins as we bumped along to the next turn, the newspaper route, our Sabbath. The Worcester Sunday Telegram was founded in 1884, when a telegram meant something fast. 2 years later, it became a daily. It was never a great paper, but it was always a pretty good paper, useful, gossipy, and resolute. It cultivated talent. The poet Stanley Kunitz was a staff writer for the Telegram in the 1920s. The New York Times reporter Douglas Neeland, who covered Kent State and Charles Manson, began his career there in the 1950s. Joe McGinnis reported for the Telegram in the 1960s before writing The Selling of the President. From bushy-bearded 19th century politicians to baby-faced George W. Bush, the paper was steadfastly Republican. If mainly concerned with scandals and mustachioed villains close to home, overdue repairs to the main branch of the public library, police raids on illegal betting establishments, "Worcester dog chases Worcester cat over Worcester fence," as the old Washington press corps joke about a typical headline in a local paper goes. Its pages rolling off giant thrumming presses in a 4-story building that overlooked City Hall, the way every city paper used to look out over every city hall, the bat signal over Gotham. Most newspapers like that haven't lasted. Between 1970 and 2016, the year the American Society of News Editors quit counting, 500 or so dailies went out of business. That's between 1970 and 2016, 46 years, 500 dailies went out of business. The rest cut news coverage, or shrank the paper's size, or stopped producing a print edition, or did all of that, and it still wasn't enough. The newspaper mortality rate is old news, and nostalgia for dead papers is itself pitiful at this point, even though I still say there's a principle involved. Quote, "I wouldn't weep about a shoe factory or a branch line railroad shutting down," Hayward Brown, the founder of the American Newspaper Guild, said when the New York World went out of business in 1931. Quote, "But newspapers are different." And the bleeding hasn't stopped. Between January 2017 and April of 2018, a third of the nation's largest newspapers, including the Denver Post and the San Jose Mercury News, reported layoffs. In a newer trend, so did about a quarter of digital native news sites. BuzzFeed News laid off 100 people in 2017. Speculation is that BuzzFeed is trying to dump it. The Huffington Post paid most of its writers nothing for years, upping that recently to just above nothing. And yet, despite taking in $146 million in advertising revenue in 2018, it failed to turn a profit. Even veterans of August and still thriving papers are worried, especially about the fake news that's risen from the ashes of the dead news. Quote, "We are, for the first time in modern history, facing the prospect of how societies would exist without reliable news." Close quote. Alan Rusbridger, for 20 years the editor-in-chief of The Guardian, writes in Breaking News, The Remaking of Journalism and Why It Matters Now. Quote, "There are not that many places left that do quality news well or even aim to do it at all." Close quote. Jill Abramson, a former executive editor of the New York Times, writes in Merchants of Truth, The Business of News and the Fact and the fight for facts. Like most big paper reporters and editors who write about the crisis of journalism, Rusbridger and Abramson are interested in national and international news organizations. The local story is worse. First came conglomeration. Worcester, Massachusetts, the second largest city in New England, used to have 4 dailies: the Telegram in the morning and the Gazette in the evening, under the same ownership, the Spy, and the Post. Now it has 1. The last great laying waste to American newspapers came in the early decades of the 20th century, mainly owing to A, radio, and B, the Depression. The number of dailies fell from 2,042 in 1920 to 1,754 in 1944, leaving 1,103 cities with only 1 paper in 1944. Newspaper circulations rose between 1940 and 1990, but likely only because more people were reading fewer papers. And as A.J. Liebling once observed, nothing is crummier than a one-paper town. A.J. Liebling. In 1949, after yet another New York daily closed its doors, Liebling predicted, quote, "If the trend continues, New York will be a 1 or 2 paper town by about 1975, close quote. He wasn't that far off. In the 1980s and 90s, as Christopher B. Daly reports in, quote, "Covering America, a narrative history of the nation's newspapers," the big kept getting bigger. Conglomeration can be good for business, but it has generally been bad for journalism. Media companies that want to get bigger tend to swallow up other media companies, suppressing competition and taking on debt, which makes publishers cowards. In 1986, the publisher of the San Francisco Chronicle bought the Worcester Telegram and the Evening Gazette. And 3 years later, right about when Time and Warner became Time Warner, the Telegram and the Gazette became the Telegram and Gazette, or the TNG. Smaller fries, but the same potato. Next came the dot-coms. Craigslist went online in the Bay Area in 1996 and spread across the continent like a weed, choking off local newspapers' most reliable source of revenue, classified ads. The TNG tried to hold on to its classified advertising section by wading into the shallow waters of the internet. At telegram.com, where it was called acronymically and not a little desperately Tango. Then began yet another round of corporate buyouts, deeply leveraged deals conducted by executives answerable to stockholders seeking higher dividends and not better papers. In 1999, the New York Times Company bought the TNG for nearly $300 million. By 2000, only 350 of the 1,500 daily newspapers left in the United States were independently owned. And only 1 out of every 100 American cities that had a daily newspaper was anything other than a one-paper town. Then came the fall, when papers all over the country, shackled to mammoth corporations and a lumbering century-old business model, found themselves unable to compete with the upstarts. Online news aggregators like the Huffington Post, established 2005, and Breitbart News, established 2007, which were, to readers, free. News aggregators also drew display advertisers away from print. Facebook and Google swallowed advertising accounts whole. Big papers found ways to adapt. Smaller papers mainly folded. Between 1994 and 2016, years when the population of Worcester County rose by more than 100,000, daily home delivery of the TNG declined from more than 120,000 to barely 30,000. In 1 year alone, circulation fell by 29%. In 2012, after another round of layoffs, the TNG left its building, its much reduced staff small enough to fit into 2 floors of an office building nearby. The next year, the owner of the Boston Red Sox bought the newspaper, along with the Boston Globe, from the New York Times Company for $70 million, $70 million, only to unload the TNG less than a year later for $17 million to Halifax Media Group, which held it for only half a year, before Halifax itself was bought, flea market style, by an entity that calls itself, unironically, the New Media Investment Group. The numbers mask an uglier story. In the past half century, and especially in the past 2 decades, journalism itself, the way news is covered, reported, written, and edited, has changed, including in ways that have made possible the rise of fake news. And not only because of mergers and acquisitions and corporate ownership and job losses and Google search and Facebook and BuzzFeed. There's no shortage of amazing journalists at work, clear-eyed and courageous, broad-minded and brilliant, and no end of fascinating innovation in matters of form, especially in visual storytelling. Still, journalism, as a field, is as addled as an addict, gaunt, wasted, and twitchy. Its pockets as empty as its nights are sleepless. It's faster than it used to be, so fast. It's also edgier and needier and angrier. It wants and it wants and it wants. But what does it need? The daily newspaper is the taproot of modern journalism. Dailies mainly date to the 1830s, the decade in which the word journalism was coined, meaning daily reporting, the jour in journalism. Early dailies depended on subscribers to pay the bills. The press was partisan, readers were voters, and the news was meant to persuade, and voter turnout was high. But by 1900, advertising made up more than 2/3 of the revenue at most of the nation's 18,000 newspapers, and readers were consumers, and voter turnout began its long fall. Quote, "The newspaper is not a missionary or a charitable institution, but a business that collects and publishes news which the people want and are willing to buy," close quote, one Missouri editor said in 1892. Newspapers stopped rousing the rabble so much because businesses wanted readers no matter their politics. Quote, "There is a sentiment gaining ground to the effect that the public wants its politics straight," a journalist wrote the following year. Reporters pledged themselves to, quote, "facts, facts, and more facts," close quote. And as the press got less partisan and more ad-based, newspapers sorted themselves out not by their readers' political leanings, but by their incomes. If you had a lot of money to spend, you read the St. Paul Pioneer Press. If you didn't have very much, you read the St. Paul Dispatch. Unsurprisingly, critics soon began writing big books, usually indictments, about the relationship between businesses and journalism. Quote, "When you read your daily paper, are you reading facts or propaganda?" Close quote, Upton Sinclair asked on the jacket of The Brass Check in 1919. In The Disappearing Daily in 1944, Oswald Garrison Villard mourned, quote, "What was once a profession, but is now a business." The big book that inspired Jill Abramson to become a journalist was David Halberstam's The Powers That Be from 1979. I read that. A history of the rise of the modern corporate-based media in the middle decades of the 20th century. Halberstam, who won a Pulitzer Prize in 1964 for his reporting from Vietnam for the New York Times, took up his story more or less where Villard left off. He began with FDR and CBS Radio, added the Los Angeles Times, Time Inc., and CBS Television, and reached his story's climax with the Washington Post and the New York Times and the publication of the Pentagon Papers in 1971. Halberstam argued that between the 1930s and the 1970s, radio and television brought a new immediacy to reporting. While the resources provided by corporate owners and the demands made by an increasingly sophisticated national audience led to harder-hitting, investigative, adversarial reporting, the kind that could end a war and bring down a president. Richard Revere summed it up best, quote, "What the Los Angeles Times, the Washington Post, Time, and CBS have in common," and CBS was the last one there, "the Los Angeles Times, the Washington Post, Time, and CBS have in common is that under pressures generated internally and externally, they moved from venality or parochialism or mediocrity or all three to something approaching journalistic excellence and responsibility," close quote. That move, writes Jill LePore, came at a price. Halberstam wrote, quote, "Watergate like Vietnam, had obscured one of the central new facts about the role of journalism in America. Only very rich, very powerful corporate institutions like these had the impact, the reach, and above all, the resources to challenge the President of the United States, close quote. There's reach, and then there's reach. When I was growing up in the 1970s, nobody I knew read the New York Times, the Washington Post, or the Wall Street Journal. Nobody I knew even read the Boston Globe, a paper that used to have a rule that no piece should ever be so critical of anyone that its, quote, writer could not shake hands the next day with the man about whom he had written, close quote. After journalism put up its dukes, my father only ever referred to the Globe as that communist rag, not least because in 1967 it became the first major paper in the United States to come out against the Vietnam War. The view of the new journalism held by people like my father escaped Halberstam's notice. In 1969, Nixon's vice president, Spiro Agnew, delivered a speech drafted by the Nixon aide, Pat Buchanan, accusing the press of liberal bias. It's, quote, good politics for us to kick the press around, close quote, Nixon is said to have told his staff. I need a cough button. It's good politics for us to kick the press around. That's Nixon, sorry. Is said to have told his staff. The press, Agnew said, represents, quote, a concentration of power over American public opinion unknown in history, close quote. Consisting of men who, quote, read the same newspapers and talk constantly to one another, close quote. How dare they? Jill LePore. How dare they? Halberstam waved this aside as so much PR hooey, but as has since become clear, Agnew reached a ready audience, especially in houses like mine. Spiro who? Quote, the press regarded Agnew with uncontrolled hilarity, Arthur Schlesinger Jr. observed in 1970, but, quote, no one can question the force of Spiro T. Agnew's personality, nor the impact of his speeches, close quote. No scholar of journalism can afford to ignore Agnew anymore. In the book On Press, The Liberal Values That Shaped the News, close quote, the historian Matthew Pressman argues that any understanding of the crisis of journalism in the 21st century has to begin by vanquishing the ghost of Spiro T. Agnew. For Pressman, the pivotal period for the modern newsroom is what Abramson called Halberstam's Golden Age, between 1960 and 1980. And its signal feature was the adoption not of a liberal bias, but of liberal values. Quote, interpretation replaced transmission, and adversarialism replaced deference, close quote. In 1960, 9 out of every 10 articles in the Times about the presidential election were descriptive. By 1976, more than half were interpretive. This turn was partly a consequence of television. People who simply wanted to find out what happened could watch television, so newspapers had to offer something else. And partly a consequence of McCarthyism. Quote, the rise of McCarthy has compelled newspapers of integrity to develop a form of reporting which puts into context what men like McCarthy have to say, close quote. The radio commentator Elmer Davis in 1953. 5 years later, the Times added news analysis as a story category. Quote, once upon a time, news stories were like tape recorders. The Bulletin of the American Society of Newspaper Editors commented in 1963, quote, no more. A whole generation of events had taught us better. Hitler and Goebbels, Stalin and McCarthy, automation and analog computers and missiles, close quote. These changes weren't ideologically driven, Pressman insists, but they had ideological consequences. At the start, leading conservatives approved. Quote, to keep a reporter's prejudices out of a story is commendable, close quote, Irving Kristol wrote in 1967. Quote, to keep his judgment out of a story is to guarantee that the truth will be emasculated, close quote. After the Times and the Post published the Pentagon Papers, Kristol changed his spots. Journalists, he complained in 1972, were now, quote, engaged in a perpetual confrontation with the social and political order. The establishment, as they say, close quote. By 1975, after Watergate, Kristol was insisting that, quote, most journalists today or liberals, close quote. With that, the conservative attack on the press was off and running. All the way to Trumpism. Quote, the failing New York Times, CNN is fake news, the press is the true enemy of the people. And in a revolution devouring its elders sort of way, the shutting down of William Crystal's Weekly Standard in December. Quote, the pathetic and dishonest Weekly Standard is flat broke and out of business, Trump tweeted. May it rest in peace. What McCarthy and television were for journalism in the 1950s, Trump and social media would be in the 2010s, licensed to change the rules. Halberstam's golden age, or what he called journalism's high watermark, ended about 1980. Perfect timing for a guy like me, huh? Halberstam's golden age, or what he called journalism's high watermark, ended about 1980. Abramson's analysis in Merchants of Truth begins with journalism's low watermark in 2007, the year after Facebook launched its news feed. Quote, the year everything began to fall apart. The book Merchants of Truth isn't just inspired by The Powers That Be, the Halberstam book. It's modeled on it. Abramson's book follows Halberstam's structure and mimics its style, chronicling the history of a handful of nationally prominent media organizations, in her case, BuzzFeed, Vice, The Times, and The Washington Post, in alternating chapters that are driven by character sketches and reported scenes. The book is saturated with a lot of gossip and glitz, including details about the restaurants the powers that be frequent and what they wear. Sulzberger, the Times publisher, quote, dressed in suits from Bloomingdale's, stylish without being ostentatiously bespoke, and wore suspenders before they went out of fashion, close quote, alongside crucial insights about structural transformations like how web and social media publishing unbundled the newspaper so that readers who used to find a fat newspaper on their front porch could, on their phones, look instead at only one story. Quote, each individual article now lived on its own page, where it had a unique URL and it could be shared and spread virally, close quote, Abramson observes. Quote, this put stories rather than papers in competition with one another. This history is a chronicle of missed opportunities, missteps, and lessons learned the hard way. As long ago as 1992, an internal report at the Washington Post urged the mounting of an electronic product, 1992. The Post ought to be in the forefront of this, close quote. Early on, The Guardian started a new media lab, which struck a lot of people as frivolous. Rustbridger writes, because at the time, quote, only 3% of households owned a PC and a modem, close quote. A situation not unlike that at The Guardian's own offices, where, quote, it was rumored that downstairs a bloke called Paul in IT had a Mac connected to the internet, close quote. A 1996 business plan for The Guardian concluded that the priority was print, and the London Times editor, Simon Jenkins predicted, quote, the internet will strut an hour upon the stage and then take its place in the ranks of the lesser media, close quote. In 2005, the Post lost a chance at 10% investment in Facebook, whose returns, as Abramson points out, would have floated the newspaper for decades. The CEO of the Washington Post company, Don Graham, and Mark Zuckerberg shook hands over the deal, making a verbal contract. But when Zuckerberg weaseled out of it to take a better offer, Graham, out of kindness to a young fella just starting out, simply let him walk away. The next year, the Post shrugged off a proposal from two of its star political reporters to start a spin-off website. They went on to found Politico. The Times, Abramson writes, declined an early chance to invest in Google and was left to throw the kitchen sink at its failing business model, including adding a Thursday-style section to attract more high-end advertising revenue. Bill Keller, then the newspaper's editor, said, quote, if luxury porn is what saves the Baghdad Bureau, so be it, close quote. Luxury porn. More alarm. Whoa, sorry. I'm sorry. The new mic, I've got to get used to the level, so forgive me for getting very loud there. Let me try that again, especially before reading the words more alarming. More alarming than what the Times and the Post failed to do was how so much of what they did do was determined less by their own editors than by executives at Facebook and BuzzFeed. If journalism has been reinvented during the past 2 decades, it has, in the main, been reinvented not by reporters and editors, but by tech companies in a sequence of events that, in Abramson's harrowing telling, resemble a series of puerile stunts more than acts of public service. Who even are these people? Merchants of truth, the book, has been charged with factual errors, including by people Abramson interviewed, especially younger journalists. She can also be maddeningly condescending. She doffs her cap at Sulzberger with his natty suspenders, but dismisses younger reporters at places like Vice as notably mainly for being, quote, impossibly hip with interesting hair, close quote. This is distracting and too bad because there is a changing of the guard worth noting, and it's not incidental. It's critical. All the way through to the 1980s, all sorts of journalists, including magazine, radio, and television reporters, got their start working on daily newspapers, learning the ropes and the rules. Russ Bridger started out in 1976 as a reporter at the Cambridge Evening News, which covered stories that included a petition about a pedestrian crossing and a root vegetable that looked like Winston Churchill. In the UK, a reporter who wanted to go to Fleet Street had first to work for 3 years on a provincial newspaper, pounding the pavement. Much the same applied in the US, where a cub reporter did time at the Des Moines Register or the Worcester Telegram before moving up to the New York Times or the Herald Tribune. Beat reporting, however, is not the backstory of the people who, beginning in the 1990s, built the new media. Jonah Peretti started out soaking up postmodern theory at UC Santa Cruz in the mid-1990s, and later published a scholarly journal article about the scrambled, disjointed, and incoherent way of thinking produced by accelerated visual experiences under late capitalism, or something like that. Imagine an article written by that American Studies professor in Don DeLillo's White Noise. Peretti thought that watching a lot of MTV can mess with your head. Quote, the rapid-fire succession of signifiers in MTV-style media erodes the viewer's sense of temporal continuity, close quote, leaving you confused, stupid, and lonely. Open quote, capitalism needs schizophrenia, but it also needs egos, Peretti wrote. Quote, the contradiction is resolved through the acceleration of the temporal rhythm of late capitalist visual culture. This type of acceleration encourages weak egos that are easily formed and fade away just as easily, close quote. Voila, a business plan, writes Jill LePore. Peretti's career in viral content began in 2001 with a prank involving email and Nike sneakers while he was a graduate student at the MIT Media Lab. Peretti ordered custom sneakers embroidered with the word sweatshop and then circulated Nike's reply. In 2005, a year the New York Times company laid off 500 employees and the Post began paying people to retire early, Peretti joined Andrew Breitbart, a Matt Drudge acolyte, and Ken Lehrer, a former PR guy at AOL Time Warner, in helping Arianna Huffington, a millionaire and a former anti-feminist polemicist, launch the Huffington Post. I want to read that again. That's incredible. Jill LePore is her name. She reads everything that she wants to write about a subject and then carefully shares with us these incredible pieces. What an amazing researcher and what an excellent writer. I'm going to give you that sentence again because it's incredible. First of all, we were just talking about Peretti ordering custom sneakers with the word sweatshop embroidered on them. Nike obviously sending back a negative reply, and that was his stunt in the very first viral content stunt in 2001. Now, that was 2001, okay. In 2005, a year the New York Times company laid off 500 employees, and the Post began paying people to retire early, Peretti joined Andrew Breitbart, a Matt Drudge acolyte, and Ken Lehrer, a former PR guy at AOL Time Warner, In helping Ariana Huffington, a millionaire and a former anti-feminist polemicist, launch the Huffington Post, Peretti was in charge of innovations that included a click-o-meter. Within a couple of years, the Huffington Post had more web traffic than the Los Angeles Times, the Washington Post, and the Wall Street Journal. Its business was banditry. Abramson writes that when the Times published a deeply reported exclusive story about WikiLeaks, which took months of investigative work and a great deal of money, the Huffington Post published its own version of the story using the same headline and beat out the Times story in Google rankings. Quote, "We were learning that the internet behaved like a clattering of jackdaws," close quote. Russ Bridger writes, open quote, "Nothing remained exclusive for more than 2 minutes," close quote. Pretty soon, there were jackdaws all over the place, with their schizophrenic late capitalist accelerated signifiers. Breitbart left the Huffington Post and started Breitbart News around the same time that Peretti left to focus on his own company, Contagious Media, from which he launched BuzzFeed, where he tested the limits of virality with offerings like the 7 best links about gay penguins and YouTube porn hacks. He explained his methods in a pitch to venture capitalists. Quote, "Raw buzz is automatically published the moment it is detected by our algorithm. And the future of the industry is advertising as content," close quote. Facebook launched its news feed in 2006. In 2008, Peretti mused on Facebook, quote, "Thinking about the economics of the news business," close quote. The company added its like button in 2009. Peretti set likability as BuzzFeed's goal. And to perfect the instruments for measuring it, he enlisted partners, including the Times and the Guardian, to share their data with him in exchange for his reports on their metrics. Lists were liked. Hating people was liked. And it turned out that news, which is full of people who hate other people, can be crammed into lists. Chartbeat, a content intelligence company founded in 2009, launched a feature called Newsbeat in 2011. Chartbeat offers real-time web analytics, displaying a constantly updated report on web traffic that tells editors what stories people are reading and what stories people are skipping. The Post winnowed out reporters based on their Chartbeat numbers. At the offices of Gawker, the Chartbeat dashboard was displayed on a giant screen. In 2011, Peretti launched BuzzFeed News, hiring a 35-year-old Politico journalist, Ben Smith, as its editor-in-chief. Smith asked for a, quote, "scoop a day," close quote, from his reporters, who, he told Abramson, had little interest in the rules of journalism. Quote, "They didn't even know what rules they were breaking," close quote. In 2012, BuzzFeed introduced 3 new one-click ways for readers to respond to stories beyond just liking them: LOL, OMG, and WTF, and ran lists like, quote, 10 reasons everyone should be furious about the Trayvon Martin's murder, in which, as Abramson explains, BuzzFeed, quote, simply lifted what it needed from reports published elsewhere, repackaged the information, and presented it in a way that emphasized sentiment and celebrity, close quote. BuzzFeed makes a distinction between BuzzFeed and BuzzFeed News, just as newspapers and magazines draw distinctions between their print and their digital editions. These distinctions are lost on most readers. BuzzFeed News covered the Trayvon Martin story, but its information, like BuzzFeed's, came from Reuters and the Associated Press. Even as news organizations were pruning reporters and editors, Facebook was pruning its users' news with the commercially appealing but ethically indefensible idea that people should see only the news they want to see. In 2013, Silicon Valley began reading its own online newspaper, The Information. Its high-priced subscription peddled to the information elite, following the motto, quote, "quality stories breed quality subscribers," close quote. Facebook's goal, Zuckerberg explained in 2014, was to, quote, build the perfect personalized newspaper for every person in the world, close quote. Ripples at Facebook create tsunamis in newsrooms. The ambitious news site Mike, M-I-C, relied on Facebook to reach an audience through a video program called Mike Dispatch on Facebook Watch. Last fall, after Facebook suggested that it would drop the program, MIC Mike collapsed. Every time Facebook News tweaks its algorithm, tweaks made for commercial, not editorial, reasons, news organizations drown in the undertow. An automated Facebook feature called Trending Topics, introduced in 2014, turned out to mainly identify junk as trends. And so news curators, who tended to be recent college graduates, were given a new manual mandate, quote, massage the algorithm, which meant deciding themselves which stories mattered. The fake news that roiled the 2016 election, a lot of that was stuff on trending topics. Last year, Facebook discontinued the feature. BuzzFeed surpassed the Times website in reader traffic in 2013. BuzzFeed News is subsidized by BuzzFeed, which, like many websites, including, at this point, those of most major news organizations, makes money by way of native advertising ads that look like articles. In some publications, these fake stories are easy to spot. In others, they're not. At BuzzFeed, they're in the same font as every other story. BuzzFeed's native advertising bounty meant that BuzzFeed News had money to pay reporters and editors, and it began producing some very good and very serious reporting, real news having become something of a luxury good. By 2014, BuzzFeed employed 150 journalists, including many foreign correspondents. It was obsessed with Donald Trump's rumored presidential bid and followed him on what it called the fake campaign trail as early as January of 2014. Quote, it used to be the New York Times, now it's BuzzFeed, Trump said wistfully. Quote, the world has changed, close quote. At the time, Steve Bannon was stumping for Trump on Breitbart. Left or right, a Trump presidency was just the sort of story that could rack up the LOLs, OMGs, and WTFs. It still is. In March 2014, the Times produced an innovation report announcing that the newspaper had fallen behind in, quote, the art and science of getting our journalism to readers, close quote, a field led by BuzzFeed. That May, Sulzberger fired Abramson, who had been less than all in about the Times doing things like running native ads. Meanwhile, BuzzFeed purged from its website more than 4,000 of its early stories, open quote. It's stuff made at a time when people were really not thinking of themselves as doing journalism, close quote, Ben Smith explained. Not long afterward, the Times began running more lists, from book recommendations to fitness tips to takeaways from presidential debates. The Times remains unrivaled. It staffs bureaus all over the globe and sends reporters to some of the world's most dangerous places. It has more than a dozen reporters in China alone. Nevertheless, BuzzFeed News became more like the Times, and the Times became more like BuzzFeed because readers, as Chartbeat announced on its endlessly flickering dashboards, wanted lists and luxury porn and people to hate. The Guardian, founded as the Manchester Guardian in 1821, has been held by a philanthropic trust since 1936, which somewhat insulates it from market forces, just as Jeff Bezos' ownership now does something similar for the Post. By investing in digital readership, research from the time Russ Bridger took charge in 1995, The Guardian became, for a while, the online market leader in the UK. By 2006, two-thirds of its digital readers were outside the UK. In 2007, The Guardian undertook what Russ Bridger calls, quote, the Great Integration, pulling its web and print parts together into a single news organization with the same editorial management. It also developed a theory about the relationship between print and digital, deciding in 2011 to be a, quote, digital-first organization, and to, quote, make print a slower, more reflective read, which would not aspire to cover the entire waterfront in news, Close quote. Russ Bridger explains with a palpable grief his dawning realization that the rise of social media meant that, quote, chaotic information was free, good information was expensive, close quote, which meant in turn that, quote, good information was increasingly for smaller elites, and that, quote, it was harder for good information to compete on equal terms with bad, close quote. He takes these circumstances as something of a dare. Quote, our generation had been handed the challenge of rethinking almost everything societies had for centuries taken for granted about journalism, close quote. Has that challenge been met? The Guardian's own success is mixed. As of 2018, it was in the black, partly by relying on philanthropy, especially in the US. Reader revenue in the form of donations, marked not as subscriptions but as voluntary memberships, is expected to overtake advertising revenue before long. Raising money from people who care about journalism has allowed The Guardian to keep the website free. I'm going to repeat that sentence. Raising money from people who care about journalism has allowed The Guardian of the UK to keep the website free. It's also broken some big stories, from the Murdoch papers' phone hacking scoop to the saga of Edward Snowden, and provided riveting coverage of ongoing and urgent stories, especially climate change. But for all its fine reporting and substantive long reads, the paper consists disproportionately of ideologically unvarying opinion essays. By some measures, journalism entered a new Trumpian gold-plated age during the 2016 campaign. With the Trump bump, when news organizations found that the more they featured Trump, the better their chart beat numbers, which, arguably, is a lot of what got him elected. The bump swelled into a lump, and later a malignant tumor, a carcinoma the size of Cleveland. Within 3 weeks of the election, the Times added 132,000 new subscribers. This effect hasn't extended to local papers. News organizations all over the world now advertise their services as the remedy to Trumpism and to fake news. Fighting Voldemort and his dark arts is a good way to rake in readers. And scrutiny of the administration has produced excellent work, the very best of journalism. How President Trump is Saving Journalism, a 2017 post on Forbes.com, marked Trump as the Nixon to today's rising generation of Woodwards and Bernsteins. Superb investigative reporting is published every day by news organizations both old and new, including BuzzFeed News. By the what doesn't kill you line of argument, the more forcefully Trump attacks the press, the stronger the press becomes. Unfortunately, that's not the full story. All kinds of editorial decisions are now outsourced to Facebook's news feed, Chartbeat, or other forms of editorial automation, while the hands of many flesh and blood editors are tied to so many algorithms. For one reason and another, including 21st century journalism's breakneck pace, stories now routinely appear that might not have been published a generation ago, prompting contention within the reportorial ranks. In 2016, when BuzzFeed News released the Steele dossier, many journalists disapproved, including CNN's Jake Tapper, who got his start as a reporter for the Washington City paper. Quote, "It is irresponsible to put uncorroborated information on the internet," Tapper said. "It's why we did not publish it and why we did not detail any specifics from it, because it was uncorroborated, and that's not what we do," close quote. The Times veered from its normal practices when it published an anonymous opinion essay by a senior official in the Trump administration. And the New Yorker posted a story online about Brett Kavanaugh's behavior when he was an undergraduate at Yale, which Republicans in the Senate pointed to as evidence of a liberal conspiracy against the nominee. There's plenty of room to argue over these matters of editorial judgment. Reasonable people disagree. Occasionally, these disagreements fall along a generational divide. Younger journalists often chafe against editorial restraint, not least because their cohort is far more likely than senior newsroom staff to include people from groups that have been explicitly and viciously targeted by Trump and the policies of his administration, a long and growing list that includes people of color, women, immigrants, Muslims, members of the LGBTQ community, and anyone with family in Haiti or any of the other countries Trump deems shitholes. Sometimes younger people are courageous, and sometimes they are heedless, and sometimes those two things are the same. Quote, the more woke staff thought that urgent times called for urgent measures, Abramson writes, and that, quote, the dangers of Trump's presidency obviated the old standards, close quote. Still, by no means is the divide always or even usually generational. Abramson, for instance, sided with BuzzFeed News about the Steele dossier, just as she approves of the use of the word lie to refer to Trump's lies, which by the Post's reckoning came at the rate of more than a dozen a day last year in 2018. The broader problem is that the depravity, mendacity, vulgarity, and menace of the Trump administration have put a lot of people, including reporters and editors, off their stride. The present crisis, which is nothing less than a derangement of American life, has caused many people in journalism to make decisions they regret or might yet. In the age of Facebook, Chartbeat, and Trump legacy news organizations, hardly less than startups, have violated or changed their editorial standards in ways that have contributed to political chaos and epistemological mayhem. I'm going to read that sentence again. In the age of Facebook, Chartbeat, and Trump, legacy news organizations, hardly less than startups, have violated or changed their editorial standards in ways that have contributed to political chaos and epistemological mayhem. Do editors sit in a room on Monday morning, twirl the globe, and decide what stories are most important? Or do they watch Trump's Twitter feed and let him decide? It often feels like the latter. Sometimes what doesn't kill you doesn't make you stronger. It makes everyone sick. The more adversarial the press, the more loyal Trump's followers, the more broken American public life. The more desperately the press chases readers, the more our press resembles our politics. The problems are well understood, the solutions harder to see. Good reporting is expensive, but readers don't want to pay for it. The donation-funded ProPublica, quote, an independent nonprofit newsroom that produces investigative journalism with moral force, close quote, employs more than 75 journalists. That's ProPublica. Good reporting is slow. Good stories unfold. And most stories that need telling don't involve the White House. The Correspondent, that's in caps, an English language version of the Dutch website De Correspondent, is trying to unbreak the news. It won't run ads. It won't collect data, or at least not much. It won't have subscribers. Like NPR, it will be free for everyone, supported by members who pay what they can. Quote, we want to radically change what news is about, how it is made, and how it is funded. Close quote. Its founders stated. Push notifications on news is bad for you, they say. Quote, because it pays more attention to the sensational, exceptional, negative, recent, and incidental, thereby losing sight of the ordinary, usual, positive, historical, and systematic. Close quote. What will the Correspondent look like? It will stay above the fray. It might sometimes be funny. It's slated to debut sometime this year in 2019. Aside from the thing about ads, it sounds a lot like a magazine when magazines came in the mail. This one did. After we'd shoved the last fat Worcester Sunday telegram inside the last unlatched screen door, we'd head home, my father taking turns a little too fast, so that we'd have to clutch at one another and at the lip of the tailgate to keep from falling off. Dad, slow down, we'd squeal, not meaning it. Then he'd make breakfast, hot chocolate with marshmallows in the winter, orange juice from a can of frozen concentrate in the summer. And on my plate, I'd make wedges of cantaloupe into Viking ships sailing across a sea of maple syrup from the coast of Bacon to Pancake Island. After breakfast, we'd dump the money from the tobacco tins onto the kitchen table and count coins, stacking quarters and nickels and dimes into wrappers from the Worcester County Institution for Savings, while my father updated the accounts and made the collection list. Going collecting was a drag. You had to knock on people's doors and ask your neighbors for money. Telegram, collecting. And it was embarrassing. And half the time they'd ask you in, and before you knew it, you'd be helping out, and it would take all day. So as long as you're here, could you hold the baby while I take a quick shower? Honey, after this, could you bring my mail down to the post office on that cute little bike of yours? Close quote. I came to understand that the people who didn't leave the money under the mat hadn't forgotten to. They just liked having a kid visit on Sunday afternoon. The death of a newspaper is sometimes like other deaths. The Mrs. and the Miss. A very, very old woman and her very old daughter lived in a crooked green house on top of a rise and wore matching housecoats and slippers. The Miss followed the Misses around like a puppy, and if you found them in the parlor reading the paper, the Misses would be poring over the opinion pages while the Miss cut pictures out of the funnies. Quote, "The Miss can't think straight," my father said. "Her head's scrambled, so be gentle with her. Nothing to be afraid of. Be sure to help them out." Close quote. Once when I biked over there, the Miss was standing, keening, noise without words, sound without sense. The Missus wasn't moving, and she wasn't ever going to move again. I called for help and held the Miss's hand. The Miss's hand. That's tricky doing that one. MISS apostrophe S, because obviously the Missus has died. Sorry, it's the last sentence too. I called for help and held the Miss's hand, waiting for the wail of sirens. I didn't know what else to do. Jill LePore, Hard News. That was the second longest piece we read here. We read Bill McKibben's piece. Both of them, interestingly, are long form about years of history and incredibly well written. So I hope that someone is watching this and listened to all of it. Or maybe you open the thing and read it yourself. I don't know. But that's that was a long one. And that's it for this ep of A Middle Perch on the Internet. I'm MTK on the MIC.